All right.
I think we can get started.
Okay, welcome. Thanks for attending Agriculture 5. I'm the session chair, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Yonas. Get us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's a difficult session. I know last day, the first session is tough. People have been probably hanging out and drinking last night, so we're grateful that you're here. My name is Yonas Alem. I'm based at the University of Gothenburg. This is a joint paper with one of my PhD students on measuring the impact of the 2016 large-scale El Nino-induced drought on livestock consumption and milk production. We use the World Bank Living Standard Measurement data. So the question is straightforward. What is the impact of the 2015 El Nino-induced drought on livestock holding and meat production? And the motivation is also straightforward. We all know from kind of graduate development economics that households in developing countries are vulnerable to numerous risks and shocks. Most are insured through informal insurance. Most are uninsured through informal insurance mechanisms. So idiosyncratic shocks are partially insured, but covariate shocks are not. So this is kind of a stylized fact. So both short covariate shocks and idiosyncratic shocks also have long-term implications on households' welfare. So what we do is, that's the motivation. So the shocks and how they affect households is the motivation. So what we do is we measure the impact of the 2015 El Nino-induced drought. And we have two outcome variables, livestock holding in tropical livestock units and milk production. We use panel data collected before and after the drought. So that makes it the ideal setup to use difference and differences estimator. For some of you know what El Nino is. It's the unusual warming of the sea surface temperature in the tropical Pacific occurring every 2 to 7 years. It can cause heavy rain and flooding. The 2015-16 El Nino-induced drought was notable in its strength and power. It has negative impact on crop production, livestock, and agricultural livelihood. It affected globally about 60 million people. In Africa, it resulted in massive drought. Ethiopia, almost 10 million people affected. Somalia, 4.7. Southern Africa, 40 million. In Latin America, it resulted again in drought. Haiti, Central America, 3.5 to 3.6 million people. In Asia, it resulted in cyclones, frost in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. So it was large. So specifically in Ethiopia, it resulted in failure of 2 consecutive rainy seasons. The bulk, which is a short rainy season, which is responsible for about 10% of the agricultural production, and erratic and delayed summer or main rainy season. That is where the 90% of the production comes. So it is the worst drought the country experienced in decades, and a million people required emergency food assistance, and there was large-scale livestock mortality and morbidity. So what is our contribution in this? Well, academically speaking, we add to the literature on the impact of climatic shocks. There's large documented effects on agriculture because agriculture is highly vulnerable to climatic shocks. Extreme weather events like drought are becoming more and more frequent. And climate change is also making El Ninos more frequent and intense. Actually, there was a recent PNAS paper that was investigating actually El Ninos and their effects and linking it to climate change. It's making them more intense and more frequent. So there's a relatively more studies on climate and crop production, climate variables and crop production, like developed countries, developing countries. These are all the standard papers that we know, Ditches and Greenstone in developing countries, Madison and Coates. So these people try to see the impact of like these kinds of shocks on agricultural productivity. Not many studies on the livestock sector but this sector is very important. The global calorie consumption, 17%, protein consumption, 33%, and employment is about 1.1 billion people. So it is expected also to grow exponentially into the developing world because of economic growth. So how does the climate change is going to affect the livestock sector? Through reduced crop and forage, water availability, reduced animal growth and productivity, and high prevalence of outbreak of disease. So we offer insights on the effect of a major climatic event using data from Ethiopia. Ethiopia offers a very important setup actually to investigate this topic for at least 2 major reasons. One, it is highly vulnerable for drought. The country experienced more than 15 droughts since the 1960s. It's the richest country. It's a country of paradoxes, as you can see. It's the richest country in Africa and the 5th richest in the world in terms of cattle holding. So we try to tease out some of the mechanisms. So this is what the environment side, and the development side will also have contributions. Covariate shocks are insured through informal mechanisms, and they have both long-term and short-term implications on households. Several studies investigated on, the impact on technology use and adoption, household consumption, child labor, school attendance, etc. of drought. Losing a livestock may have a long-term welfare implication on poor households because and it has also a major social support and safety net implications. So in Ethiopia, for example, this is a typical use of a cattle. Actually, a cattle is just like a tractor for a poor Ethiopian farmer. We're talking about 70% of the most populous country in Africa. So the country is about 99 million at the time we experienced the shock. Now it's over 120. Out of those, 70% live in rural areas, and almost 99% or 98% of them actually produce crops just like that. So, where for some of you who don't know where Ethiopia is located, it's the Horn of Africa, and this is the map of the country, and these dots are the villages where the data was collected. So that's about 3,000, 5,000, I think, including urban and rural, but you can see that they're spread out throughout the country. And this graph also shows us the rainfall distribution. So you can see the green parts are the highlands, where there's abundant rainfall, and the red parts are where you have very almost desert. So that's a part of the Rift Valley, and dispersely populated by nomadic people. That's why you can see that the sampling, for example, puts more weight on the highlands. In terms of economic structure, macroeconomic indicators, predominantly agrarian. So 35% of the GDP, 68% of employment, and 90% of export earnings. So livestock constitutes about 45% of agriculture GDP, and overall 19% of GDP. And forex earnings, the same amount. It's a source of livelihood, input to crop production, income, diet, protein, transport. So it has a huge potential to improve the lives of millions of populations, and it contribute to poverty reduction. So loss of a livestock output and productivity in the country, unfortunately, is managed mostly traditionally, so the sector couldn't really play the role. So in terms of climate vulnerability, that's partly something that I say during the introduction. There's been a significant changes in temperatures in the 1960s. Like I said, 15 droughts, average temperature increased by 1 degree Celsius, and the number of hot nights on average increased by 37% during this 4-decade time. So that's a massive change. And there's accelerated evapotranspiration and reduced soil moisture, and significant variability in long-term precipitation and overall decline. So in some places, actually, there's over 20% reduction, say, example, south central part of the country. The data is from the World Bank Living Standard Measurement Survey, 2013-14. That's kind of the baseline. 2015-16 is the post-drought year. But we also have another survey that was collected in 2010-11. So we use it to check for the part of the trend assumption, which is an important assumption in difference and differences. It's organized by the World Bank, the Central Statistical Agency, nationally representative, 433 villages or enumeration areas, and 5,262 households. So we use the rural part of the data, which is about 3,000. It has a rich agricultural module, which collects detailed information on crop production, including livestock, and input use, crop, etc., etc. The attrition has been less than 2%, so it's not a big problem. Weather data, we use the both self-reported and meteorological data are problematic in Africa, especially. Meteorological data suffers from missing observations. The number of meteorological stations in Africa, for example, declined from 3,500 in 1990 to 500 in 2010. Actually, in Ethiopia, we have 0.03 stations per district. Warada is a district. So and then most of them are located in surplus producing areas. So you can't really trust meteorological data. So the alternative is to use the CHIRPS data, the Climate Hazard Group infrared precipitation data. It's produced by the UC Santa Barbara, contains 35 years plus quasi-global gridded rainfall data. You can get data in 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer grid. So I think it's built in using some climate models, in situ station data, combining different modeling as well. It's extensively used by other researchers. So we define drought as experiencing rainfall 20 percentile below the long-term mean. Some basic descriptive statistics. You can see that affected by drought. This is post drought information. 51. Half of the sample households are severely affected by the 2015-16 drought. Livestock holding units 5.19. So we have, unfortunately, it's a different measure. There are two measures. There's a FAO measure. If the FAO measure is half of that, so they use like a lower scale to identify or use units actually. A cattle, like a cow or an ox would be 1, and then something bigger like a camel would be 1.5, etc. These are kind of units. It's based on that construction. Milk production was about 150, 78, 80% are female. So you can see that these are smallholder farmers with very little commercialization and small land size, etc. One thing that people commented in a previous presentation is, what if we're capturing something very fundamental, different variable through the drought between the treated and the control groups? So the treated groups might have some unobservable factors that make them vulnerable for drought, because of location and things like that. So we tried to check for that. You can see that the left side shows the distribution of rainfall between the treated and control groups. They pretty much followed a similar trend until the last year, which is 2015, where they have significant divergence, right? And also on the right side, we have the distribution. We plotted distributions. You can see that the median distribution in the last 30 years was pretty much the same between the two. So there's a bit of a difference in detail, but at least you can see that the median, like most important measure of central tendency, is somehow similar. We did the same for the drought year. You can see that now it's a big difference, especially the standardized graphs show that basically the treated group had a much lower rainfall distribution than the control group. This is just introductory kind of testing. So checking for the parallel trend assumption, so we did a falsification test. So we used the drought indicator variable and tried to see if it affected milk production and livestock holding in the baseline, in the pre-baseline period. So there's no effect. So the parallel trend seems to be holding for the two groups. Now a small mean comparison in the outcome variables. Left side is livestock holding, and the right side is milk production. So you can see that at baseline there was no statistically significant difference between the two. So they were pretty much similar, statistically speaking, both in milk production and in livestock holding. But you can see that at follow-up there's a significant difference. So the control group has a much higher livestock and also a much higher milk production in liters per day. The first results, what we see is, so the first one is the difference in differences. We just, for the sake of it, I think we tried alternative matching methods. It doesn't make that much sense actually to use matching methods in this because this is an exogenous natural shock. But anyways, we just did it anyway, and we didn't find significantly different results, almost similar. So we can focus on column 1, which is the naive difference in differences. It takes a difference in differences. So you can see that there was a decline by 0.195 in livestock units. So given that, the average land livestock holding is about control mean livestock is about 2.39. So then that's about 9% decline in livestock holding. But the milk production is much larger. So you can see that there was a 0.16 liters per day, given that the average production per day was about 0.62. So that constitutes about 29%. So 29% decline on milk production and livestock holding as well. By livestock type, so we divided cattle, small animals, other animals. I mean, this distinction is very important because if household faced in cattle, then that won't have a significant implications. Because remember the the farmer that I showed you, so they used them for plowing and everything. So losing one would have a long-term implication on the welfare of poor households. So you can see that a large part of this shock was driven by cattle loss. All right? So they lost cattle more than small animals and other animals. And the key mechanism after exploring qualitative information and secondary information is because households actually, I will show you in the next graph. Maybe I should go to the mechanism and come back to here. You can see that livestock sales. So the first part shows you whether livestock death, then sales, and then livestock slaughter. So you can see that the most significant one is livestock sales. So what happened is households actually sold their bigger animals because they can't keep them during drought times. So they sold them before they die. Lack of fodder and lack of water. So that's exactly what we document. So we also checked for heterogeneous impact based on the gender of the household head. I think more male-headed households were, of course, more affected. But on the other hand, there were male-headed households were the ones that were having more livestock, and also they constituted a larger portion of the sample. That's about 82% were male-headed households. So, long story short, it has a significant impact, which is 9% on livestock holding and 28%, 29% on milk production. And the mechanism is mainly through livestock sales. We checked the robustness of the results using alternative livestock units, self-reported drought. Households were asked, for example, did you experience a significant drought? And adding some the nomadic sample. You remember there was a small sample of households from the nomadic group. We added them, we dropped them. The results remained really, really robust. So what we captured was indeed the effect. So the drought affected livestock holding by 9% and 29%. More impact on cattle. But cattle is, as we know, used for agriculture and milk production, and possible long-term impact. I think the main mechanism is a sale of livestock. And there's a clear need for safety net programs targeting the livestock holding, for example, improving a livestock feeding value chain, which is almost non-existent. In Ethiopia, they're very experienced actually in responding immediately to distributing food for people, but nothing much happened for livestock. But we know the livestock is really very important for households. So there are a lot of issues that we want to explore in the future, but for today, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
I should have done this before.
Oh, you better drink. Which one?
Discussion BP. It's not. Okay. All right. No, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yonas. It was a great paper. Okay, I'm trying to use this because my arms are not as long. Does this work? Yes. No, I have a very short discussion. The paper was really good, and I think your presentation really also enriched what was already in the paper. I think you've done also a few more things, so it's really great. We also, I'm not going to describe much of the paper because we all saw it, but it's looking at the impact of the El Niño drought. Okay, I'm having issues here. On livestock holding and milk production. The identification comes through this exposure indicator, which you build using this great CHIRPS dataset. Very accurate, very precise. And you use a combination of diff and diff with propensity score matching. Main findings, as we saw, significant impacts of drought on milk production and livestock holding, especially on milk production. And we see a number of suggested mechanisms around loss of cattle and then water stress and feed shortages, and also interesting heterogeneity analysis between men and women and asset-rich versus asset-poor farmers. I think the paper was really good, and as you said, there is not so much research at the moment on the impacts on livestock. So I think you're really filling an important knowledge gap, especially considering how important livestock is at the moment for smallholder farming, and also its contribution to a broad range of outcomes from poverty to inclusion to also sustainability and climate adaptation and mitigation. So I think your paper really speaks to that literature, and I actually think you should stress that contribution even more in your introduction. What you're talking about is really super relevant at the moment in terms of climate change, of the climate change agenda, and I think you really have a strong case that you should bring up even more in the contribution of your paper. I just have some very minor comments. related to the great analysis that you're doing already. One thing is that since you are using the propensity score and you are using a number of matching methods in your paper, I wonder whether there would be scope for adding additional systematic observable differences between treated and controls. You have a lot of household level data and some location specific data to account for the P-score, but maybe there might be other impacts that might be driving systematic differences between treated and controls that you can control for. For example, may it be the case that more drought affected areas, yes, super quick, are exposed to more extension services or other government programs, which may result in good agricultural practices that could drive your results. One other thing is, why are you only focusing on livestock ownership when you consider the difference between rich and poor households? You have the LSMS data, you can account for a lot of other variables, which I think would also be less endogenous in deriving your heterogeneity impact. And one thing that I really want to stress, because I have little time, but we can talk more, is you do have mechanisms on livestock holding, not so much for milk production, at least in the version of the paper that I read. You suggest something, but you don't really show much evidence on it. It would be nice to show some effects, for example, on feed and water shortages. You should have that in the LSMS data that you could show at least as suggestive evidence. Also to understand why the result is driven by us poor farmers in this case, and not by richer farmers, as is the case for livestock holding. Another thing for the mechanism is probably going one step beyond and looking at, for example, at effects on farming income, coping strategies, other well measures to justify why people are selling their livestock. I mean, we know that that is the case. We know that this happens in developing countries, but it would be nice to show that chain of effects. And finally, I think, again, speaking to the implications of your paper, you really have a case, as I was mentioning, on the climate agenda. So I think it's not just about talking about safety nets and support programs, but also really you have a strong case for advocating for dissemination and adoption of climate-smart livestock technologies and practices. I think it's really important because it's not just reaction, but also like going one step beyond that. But overall, really great paper, and very happy to talk more about this as needed.
Maybe we collect a few more questions, or time is up?
You have like 5-6 minutes.
Yeah, then should be enough to.
Ones you could just collect them yourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Questions? Comments? Yes.
So I'm wondering about your result that men who have more livestock are the ones who are disinvesting in livestock, and another possibility is that the livestock are actually their savings accounts, right? And during drought, you deplete your savings account, and and that seems like it's a kind of a different conclusion than the one you come to.
Yes.
And so I guess I'm wondering if it would be possible to think about, if you're saying you need 2 oxen to plow a field, whether you see people who have 2 oxen selling one of them. It seems like the women who have maybe on average 2 or less don't sell any. So I think it's worth thinking about what is livestock loss and what is savings depletion.
Yes. Thank you. Any more? Yes.
Yeah, just I think related to that and the comment that's up here, I think if you can look at some of these other wealth measures, you can see whether or not they're shifting, so they're selling their livestock in order to allow them to continue their investment in agriculture, because presumably it would just be interesting to see how quickly they recover from this, and if you don't have data post, then be able to look at that existing data along all these other measures to see how they reallocate.
Thank you.
If they are able to reallocate.
Thank you. Maybe one more there, and then yes.
So your hypothesis that they are selling, but I want to see the prices decreasing or not, because this might be important for buffer stock hypothesis.
Or prices of livestock.
Yes, and also there's a paper saying that because of poverty trap, the poor people and the rich people are decide a different way, because they want to keep livestock because this is a productive asset. So they don't sell. just because they don't like to go down to the poverty trap. So I thought you can include those literature for your contribution.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I can respond to these first and then see if we have more time left. Thank you, Viviana. Maybe I can start with you. And I mean, most of your comments are some things to consider to improve the paper. But to respond on a few ones, why livestock ownership? Yes, you're absolutely right. I think we've been thinking about, this is kind of a second version of the paper. We presented it once in another seminar. We got some comments and improved it. We'll improve it further. I think, yes, maybe land can be used as another wealth indicator, because I've done similar work before and we use livestock as important wealth indicator, but now it is the outcome variable itself that has been affected. So it's good to see how robust the results are using alternative methods. Maybe you can construct asset index or something, which this is something that we thought about. And the same is true for feed and water shortages. Your comment, yes, that's a very important comment, actually. I've been thinking about that because I know Marcia Fafchan's and others papers that were done in the Sahel region, actually, for example, people are using livestock as a buffer stock, basically, to cope with shocks during shock times, to save and to save. And there's also some story in India. In this case, we still don't show it very well, but I don't think a significant part of it explains this de-saving and saving behavior. It was rather from secondary sources. Unfortunately, the data was not really designed to collect that information. It's just, so we don't have much information, but from secondary FAO reports and other NGO reports, what we show is people wouldn't sell their cattle, actually, during times of shock. So they sell them if it is for de-saving purposes. This is small animals like sheep and goats. But I fully agree with you that we need to work a bit hard on that fact and show that which one is true, actually. And for reviewers, I see that it's important, but I'm fully aware of it. Thank you. And the same is true for price and other variables. We'll check.
Hi.
Yeah.
Ask one more question. I think you have another minute.
Yeah, good. You're the boss.
So this drought was in 1516, right?
Yes.
And then the post data is
in 16, yeah, almost 15, 16. A few months after the drought, basically covering.
If I'm not mistaken, there might be another round of the ESS. Is there a sample refresh?
Fortunately, they discontinued that sample and started a new sample. So it would have been fun to see what happened to those who lost their cattle during that time. 3 years later, in 2018, they collected, but they completely restarted with, I would say, damn, that would have been good.
Yeah, okay. Just wanted to.
Thank you all very much.
So thank you again. Thank you for being here. Last day of the conference, early morning. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's great to be back in Oxford and present again at this conference in person, especially. This is joint work with Angela and Javier from the World Bank. We're going to present results of an impact evaluation that we ran in Guatemala over the last few years, actually. Very quick summary of the paper, in case I'm not good with my time management. We're looking at short-term impacts on knowledge and business decision-making and behavioral margins of a very light-touch information campaign exploiting digital technologies in a department of Western Guatemala at the height of the COVID pandemic between January and November 2021. Spoiler of the results the intervention was about trying to connect women farmers to Guatemala's school feeding program. It's a public procurement food program, which I'm going to tell you more details about. But as a spoiler of the results, the intervention was really effective at producing more knowledge of the program as a good business opportunity for women. And also it affected selling decisions and the prices that women were receiving for the products. But actually, it wasn't enough to induce women to enroll in that specific school feeding program. And we provide some evidence of and suggested mechanisms why that could be. This paper relates to broad and emerging literature on the role of digital technologies for rural development and on the role of information in improving outcomes for small agri-businesses. Also, of course, it relates to much broader literature on women empowerment and on women agency and entrepreneurship, especially in rural areas. Very quickly about the setting. So how are women in Guatemala doing? Not really well. Guatemala ranks, if I'm remembering correctly, it's ranking 127 out of 189 countries worldwide in terms of gender equality indices. And the situation is particularly severe in rural areas. First of all, women are invisible. If you look at the agriculture census, you see that 10% of women are enrolled in agriculture. If you dig a little bit deeper and you try to account for women that report doing work on their family farm or helping their husband, the percentage grows up to 40%, and we still believe that this is an underestimate. Of those women that actually are involved in agriculture, most of them are confined to smaller scale production, informality, lower wages. You see the numbers there. I don't think it deserves any comment. Women have lower access to land. Less than 10% of all landowners in the country are women, and this, of course, affects credit and investment decisions. And cultural norms, and this relates to the first item in the list, cultural norms really confine women in a situation in which they're mostly seen at most as helpers or complementary workers to the family production, and not really as agri-entrepreneurs in and of themselves. This is reinforced by also extension systems, which most of the time, even when they reach women, they tend to focus more on household care activities, or at best on nutrition and on how women can contribute to the family farm. Of course, the situation is even worse for indigenous women for obvious reasons. I'm not going to focus too much on this graph, but just to show you, these are the main challenges reported by women in our sample in rural rural San Marcos in Guatemala. I hope you can read in the slide, but like the main listed problems are problems with remoteness and high distance from markets, low selling prices, not able to find markets where to sell their produce, and then more issues related to agricultural production, such as water stress, product damages, and post-harvest losses, which are a big issue in Guatemala specifically. I was telling you in the beginning that our intervention, and I'm going to provide few details in a couple of slides, but our intervention tried to connect women with the school feeding program. This program has been running for a very long time, I think at least since the 90s, but it has recently been upgraded. So in 2017, the government tripled the budget, and now it has quadrupled it for the program for the production of more nutritionally adequate and culturally appropriate menus for children. And very significantly, it mandated that 50% of all the production, of all the food the schools have to purchase needs to come from local family farming. And when I say local, I do mean local. It means that food needs to come from the very same municipality where the school is located. Also, importantly, prices are fixed by bargaining between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Education, allowing for some buffer related to local market conditions and for some bargaining with the networks of local producers. But prices are transparent and are published, and they have reference prices that schools and farmers can bargain on, but like within a certain band. Also, very interestingly, the school feeding program, and I apologize, I'm from the World Bank, we use acronyms, so if you see SFP, that is the school feeding program. The SFP also increased demand for foods that are traditionally produced by women in Guatemala, such as leafy vegetables, products of small animals, such as cheese, eggs, milk, and also in general, like fresh fruit and lettuce that are really overrepresented by women production. This all sounds great in practice, in theory, but in practice, the program is facing a lot of bottlenecks, mostly related to information. Everybody knows about the SFP. It's a very popular program, but it's not very obvious that producers know that they can enroll in it and they can sell to the schools. Especially they don't know about the process, they have fear about getting involved with the authorities, and also schools lack the information of reliable producers from whom they can buy the products that they need. As of today, a third of schools are not linked with any registered provider, and only 5% can meet their food demand through family farming. So what happens in practice is that schools buy food from the supermarket when the supermarket is available, or they just resort to feeding children with like lower nutritional content food. Another issue is that farmers lack awareness and also expertise to produce the foods, foods that are complying with the greater food safety and hygiene standards that are required by schools. It is great that finally there is a higher emphasis on the food safety, the school that is fed to children, but farmers are really not complying with those measures, so they really face high rejection rates, and so they cannot really sell to schools in the way they should. Again, COVID came in to complicate the picture. The program kept running even though schools were closed, but it worked through providing bags of semi-perishable foods directly to the house of the children. So it was even less straightforward to schools and farmers to link them to match. So what did we do? This work is embedded in a broader World Bank pilot that I led on producing digital technologies in support of the school feeding program. The project had many components, but here we're specifically focusing on a very light touch information campaign that we designed specifically to provide information about the school feeding program during the COVID-19 crisis. So what did we do? We designed a suite composed of one short video, like 5 minutes in total, providing information on what is the school feeding program, how to participate in it, and how to sell and register as a producer, on very simple, good quality and hygiene standards that needed to comply with, and on the adaptations to the program during COVID-19. This video was sent to women by WhatsApp, and it was followed by 6 text messages with the provider contact information, numbers and contacts of extensionists from the Ministry of Agriculture, and of the products and prices demanded by the schools in the location where the woman was located. Women were, the eligibility for participating in the program was being an adult, being engaged in agricultural production, and having access to a smartphone. So this is the caveat of this analysis. I'm sure that Philip will comment on this, but the results of what I'm showing you are specific to a subsample of women that have access to a smartphone. Having access to a smartphone doesn't mean owning it yourself, but that maybe your child has it or someone in your neighborhood has it. But like being able to access a smartphone and get this information. So this is something to keep in mind as we go forward with the description. We divided the treatment and control groups were assigned by village. We were active in 252 villages at Endline, and after attrition, we were left with a sample of 880 women. Our expected impacts were on market knowledge, entrepreneurship attitudes, and post-harvest behaviors. The identification strategy is a normal OLS. We're running an RCT, so we run a number of robustness checks, but for this presentation, this is like the main specification that you need to keep in mind. We're interested in the effect of coefficient beta. And sorry, I don't see my time. Okay, here it is. We're interested in coefficient beta, which is the effect of being assigned to one of the treated villages. As you can see, the treated and control sample are quite balanced. We also ran a regression on the reconnected sample with on the treatment, and the treatment assignment did not really have an impact on probability of being recontacted at Endline. So we are confident that the two groups are quite comparable. One thing that I did not mention is that the control group received the placebo treatment, really in similar style, duration, just different messages, and they did receive the treatment after the Endline data collection. What are our main results? Well, the digital information campaign was actually quite successful in providing information about the school feeding program as an interesting business opportunity. As I was mentioning, everybody knows about the SFP. They know it because their children are enrolled in school. They know that the government is paying for their children's food, which, by the way, may be the only food that some children receive in the day. So it's very popular. But many people, as I was mentioning, didn't know that this could be a business opportunity for them. And here you can see various margins that indicate that women after the digital campaign know that they can register and they can get engaged in the first place. Also, participants remembered the contents of the video, so it's not that they respond positively to our questions, but we probed them and they did remember the contents and the messages of the video. And they also reported a shift in the main information source about the school feeding program. First, they were mentioning they knew about the project because their children were in school or because some neighbors were telling them about it. Now they report that the main information is the Ministry of Agriculture, the main information is the video itself. So we're confident that they are actually getting an adequate intake of content about the information campaign. What we really liked is that this effect is driven by women that never participated in any agricultural training and that had never been reached by extension services. So this is really nice because it shows that we are really complementing ongoing work. It's not a substitute, of course. Digital technologies cannot be a substitute for traditional extension services, but can really act as a useful complement, especially in a situation of forced remoteness and impossibility of movements such as COVID-19. Another line of results that we saw is that the information had an impact on women's likelihood to sell animal products. This is intuitive because we're measuring impacts in the very short run. The end-line data collection was done 2 months after the treatment took place, so it's easier for women to adapt their selling and production decision among animal origin products rather than agricultural products. And interestingly, what you see here is that they're selling specifically the animal products that are demanded by schools. So it really looks like the intervention really had a targeted impact on those products. And as you see, it's mostly eggs and chicken meat. Especially eggs were also distributed much more during the COVID version of the SFP. We also don't find an effect on the number of buyers or buyer types. So we're confident that this is really, what we're observing is really an increase in sales and not an increase in the number of buyers that women report. We also have preliminary evidence, this is not in the paper, it's really new, that the information campaign also increased the prices that women receive for their products. And again, the effect does not seem to depend on changes in the extensive margin and nor on the various units of measure that prices are reported by. This is fantastic. We were very happy to see these results, but then what really was a bummer is that women were not enrolling in the school feeding program after all this, nor they were interested in participating, because one thing is saying, okay, after 2 months I still have to make up my mind, but they were not even interested in talking to registered producers, they were not interested in talking to schools. So we really didn't understand what was going on. So we started to look at the structure of the school feeding market itself, and we identified that there are a number of individual level barriers as well as market and structural level barriers, which I'm going to explain in a second. As far as individual level barriers are concerned, we looked at control group participants who were comparing registered versus non-registered producers. And what we saw is that registered producers tend to have overall a larger production capacity. So they have higher land measures, and they are also able to supply a larger pool of products throughout the year. One thing that is important is that the school feeding program demands you constant supply of products and a larger pool. It's not mandated, but most schools prefer to gather supplies from one single producer. So it's more difficult for smallholders to really cater to that continuous demand by school. At the same time, we saw that registered producers tend to be more aware of good agricultural practices and especially tend to have a larger degree of mechanization. Again, we're looking at small numbers because we are in a very rural and informal setting, but still there are significant differences between the two groups. Also, qualitative analysis we conducted with several focus groups also showed that women that are not registered tend to have lower technical and managerial skills and are generally less aware of good food quality and safety standards. And our information campaign, for as much as it contains some information on how to ensure like basic hygiene of products, was not enough to bridge that gap. Although we did have another part of the program that had like larger extension videos, but those were not analyzed in this paper. As far as market and structural level barriers are concerned, we actually thought maybe prices are not okay. Maybe the prices that are produced by the school feeding program are not really interesting for farmers. And we find mixed evidence on that. If you can see, I don't know if you can recognize the two colors, but we have in red the distribution of prices around the market prices of well, here you have eggs and here other agricultural products. And then the blue line is the prices that non-registered providers get. And you see that actually, I mean, prices are not that bad compared to market prices. What happens is that the prices demanded by the school feeding program are not enough to compensate for the extra cost of having to ensure a continuous supply, or having to ensure a greater quality of the products vis-a-vis what you can sell in the market. And so these are not enough to entice women that have other options to sell to the school feeding program rather than to the market. And also, there is some bargaining between, as I was mentioning, the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Education, and sometimes this really doesn't work in favor of producers, and that also affects the willingness of women to participate, because they are not sure that the prices that they will get will be actually favorable to them. And finally, this is the last piece of evidence that I'm showing, there are still issues with the registration process and institutional trust. For example, and I see that it's really tiny, you won't be able to see the numbers, but we found that the intervention was really successful in producing information on the registration process and also on the perception of women that registering is easy. So if you see on the second bar graph on the left, that you can see that it's actually like the percentage of women that thinks that the registering process is easy, almost like more than doubled actually compared to the control group, but we're still talking a very small percentages. It's literally 12% of women that think that it's easy. And also there are very low levels of institutional trust that, although increased for the treatment group, still remain very low, especially as regards trust in the tax authority. Final thing actually, results are much stronger, results on information, but also on willingness to enroll, are much stronger in areas where COVID was higher. So actually when women didn't have a chance to go to other markets, then they were interested in participating in the school feeding program, because that was a good alternative for them. So basically, getting to the conclusion, we show that the light touch information campaign can promote knowledge acquisition and behavioral change, but it is not enough. So digital technologies are no panacea. I was mentioning this before, but many times they are promoted as the solution to rural development. They are not. They need to be complemented by a suite of analog intervention, working on extension services, promotion of association among women and cooperative, also work on technical assistance, and especially reorganization of the market in this specific case. And finally, as I was mentioning, this is very contingent on women having access to smartphones, but also having access to internet is a key issue. So also work on the regulatory and enabling digital environments would be key to ensure that these technologies can be brought to full potential. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Viviana. I have some comments written down. I'll send you the text. But so yeah, I mean, I really like this paper. I really like the setting. Those, cheap light touch interventions are very promising, because we can do quite a few of them without breaking the bank. So it's important to see if these are effective. I have sort of three main comments. The first one is about linking the participation in this school feeding program, or in general the outcomes that you're testing, like selling livestock, to welfare outcomes like ag income, or consumption incomes, food security. Basically, just to sort of get a sense of what is the welfare implication of, is this ultimately a good thing that you're inducing, right? And the second comment is kind of related to this, which is, I guess, you're not finding that these folks these women are actually taking up the SFP or becoming producers for the SFP. And so the question is, would it raise their incomes if they did, right? Because maybe it doesn't, and then, they could say, well, it's good to know, but, it doesn't really raise my income. Or they perceive that it doesn't, which might also be enough to not participate, right? So it would be interesting to know, I feel like looking at some of the descriptives you present in the paper, that is probably the case, but you could make it explicit. Right, and the third one is the timing of the intervention. You also mentioned this in the paper. You have a very short timeline, right? It's only like a few months between baseline and endline. So I was wondering, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Can you go back and follow up with them? No, really, right? Because you gave the treatment also now to the control group, so it'll be hard. But I guess still, descriptively, it might still be interesting to see if now uptake has gone up. Yeah, because that's the other thing you mentioned. Like there was COVID, so yeah. Now you've added something on the interaction with COVID, which I found really interesting. So yeah, maybe now that the situation has sort of normalized a bit more, if you have a chance to go back and just see what these women are up to now, that could be interesting. Okay, that's what I have on comments. I have it some more detail. I'll send it to you. Do you want to take your own questions or?
So I can see everyone.
Yeah.
Questions? Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting work. I'm just wondering whether there is some network thing happening among farmers, because as you made the distinction between those who participated for extension services on the internet, so networking, and related to that, I'm wondering whether your intervention actually gives those women information about competition in the market, as in those people are now selling to SFP programs to schools, so they're having better market structure in terms of share on the non-school competition, and so they could likely be selling products that the SFP are taking but on the different markets.
Doug?
Yeah, so thanks, really interesting. And I was wondering if it struck me that there might be an opportunity here to combine a program like this with something very old-fashioned, which would be a producer cooperative. If the issue is that individual women aren't able to achieve scale and sufficient to sell to the SFP, then actually some kind of collective operations might be really beneficial. So I was wondering if you've thought of that, incorporating that.
Others? Okay, I'll start responding. No, Philip, no, thank you so much for your comments, and I look forward to the written ones. Yes, it would be great to have a look at welfare outcomes. We started looking at this, so we did a very quick data collection, and it was all done by remote phone surveying. So even the amount of questions that we could ask had to be like very targeted, but we do have something on, not really income, but we have something on reception, whether they're doing better or worse compared to pre-COVID, which we can try and see whether it links with the treatment. So again, it was a very specific data collection for this program, so there's not so much that we can play around with, but we can try and look at that. Actually, that will make the paper much more complete. I agree with you. On the timing of intervention, you responded already. But one thing that is interesting is that now DIME, the impact evaluation group of the World Bank, is doing a larger impact evaluation of another component of the project that we did. And again, I could try and go back to them and see whether we can do something together in that area of the country. Also, my funding expired like 2 years ago, so I need to find other ways of doing this. But yeah, no, it would actually be much more interesting. What was I failed to what was the second point that you made?
It was just about how they perceive the value of partaking in this.
They seem to be interesting, but then again, it was more qualitative information. So it was like in focus group, they were like, oh, this is great. Again, it's a good business opportunity, but then eventually they were not participating. So there was a little bit of a disconnect, which is why we wanted to understand through the mechanism. But yeah, we can again follow up again with that. On the networking question, great question. So everybody, we assigned treatment and control on village. And we saw that in villages that were in the control group, nobody knew about the information campaign. So we think that there was no real contamination of treated and control group. Because again, like everybody in the same village would have received either the control or the treatment. And even if they talked to each other, they would talk about the same thing. And nobody knew about the other activity that was going on in other villages. Especially, these are very remote communities. So it's also likely that there are not as many communications between one village and the next. And on the question of competition, that's a very good question. We also asked ourselves about it, and that's why also we tried to look at market prices and what happened on the market rather than just on the school feeding program. And actually, yeah, we see that there are people that were treated were actually receiving higher prices. So we think that we induced at least a comparative advantage for them, which is also why we wanted to also give the treatment to the control group after that. But in terms of competition for the school feeding program, that might be an issue in future, but right now the demand is so oversized with respect to the offer that there is really a market gap to be filled. So there may be more competition in the traditional market, not right now, not in the school feeding program, but it will definitely be an issue after, when the program finally starts working as it should be. Doug, on your question, I really like it because it's really in the policy implication of our work. So we really advocate for strengthening cooperatives and associations and also promoting a productive alliance approach adapted to the needs of like smaller scale producers. So really helping the formation of rural producer organizations and connecting them more formally with the school feeding program. To an extent, this is already happening in San Marcos. I forgot to mention that this work was also done, not this specific part, but like the overall program was done also in collaboration with the FAO and the World Food Program. And together with them, we're already working on building this producers network. Sometimes also there is one lead producer that is the one that is registered to the school feeding program, but then he or she has their own network of other rural producers in the neighborhood, and then people can basically informally register through these people. So we're trying to strengthen those links and formalize them too, because what the government is also interested in is in introducing more formality in rural areas, and this program is actually one way of doing that. Of course, it is also like, this is actually one of the issues because people don't want to formalize and they fear the tax authority. So we're working on that and on improving also institutional trust and on portraying the tax authority as a friendly counterpart, but that's not always that easy. But yes, I mean, getting back to the issue on cooperatives, yes, that's definitely one of the main policy implications of our work. Is there any other doubt, concern, question, compliment?
Just one. Can you say a little bit about this placebo bundle?
Pardon me?
There was a placebo bundle,
yes.
Right? What is that?
So the women received a video of similar duration about arts and crafts in another department, and then the text messages, we use them to share actual information on social distancing, good practices for COVID. And if you're concerned that the treatment didn't receive that information, it was included in the video. So yeah, so we also had like that positive spillover for public health. Okay, thank you so much.
5 minutes and 2 minutes. Okay. So. Okay, so I have the pleasure of closing us out today. with this paper that we wrote a while ago on agricultural productivity growth in the smallholder sector in sub-Saharan Africa. Is work we did with some co-authors, including Oxford's very own Douglas Gollin, and in the LSMS. So I'm an economist in the LSMS team at the World Bank, and we kind of try to put together as many of the existing LSMS ISA surveys as possible in a harmonized fashion that would allow us to do this kind of analysis in a sort of cross-country way, and to infer something about, after 15 or so years of the program, what can we say about agricultural productivity in the smallholder sector? So the importance of this topic, I think, is pretty clear to everyone here. The smallholder sector is really key to poverty alleviation, because a large share of the world's poor population lives in Africa, lives in rural areas, and these folks rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. And so this is also reflected in SDG targets 1 and 2. And this is also quite relevant for food security in the coming decades. And so due to this insight, there was this increased spending on agricultural research to boost productivity. So basically, with this in mind, we started looking at. We wanted to look at this LSMS plot level data to say what can we say about productivity growth in the smallholder sector in sub-Saharan Africa. And we used data, as I was saying, from the LSMS ISA from 6 countries: Ethiopia, Malawi, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Tanzania, covering a time period of 2008 to 2019. There are more than 130,000 plot observations in our data set from about 30,000 different farms. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the LSMS ISA, these are longitudinal surveys, so we can track communities, households, individuals, and even parcels in some cases. And this being a household survey, it uses 2-stage stratified sampling, which is representative of the population. This will have some implications for sort of the representativeness of the results of the agricultural sector at large. Right. The outcome variable that we use is the outcome, is the value of production per hectare in constant US dollars, aggregated across crops. So the survey records the production for each crop on each plot. And so to aggregate these different crops, we use constant US dollar prices, which basically means it's one price for the entire series for each crop in each country, right? This sort of nets out some of the price variation which might be driving the results. But I'll also show later that it doesn't really, this choice of prices doesn't really matter for kind of the trends that we find. And then on the other side, we have a lot of data, plot level data on agricultural inputs, land area, family labor, value of hired labor, seeds, fertilizer, agricultural assets, and so on. And then a bunch of plot farmer household characteristics for controls. And we also include a fairly detailed set of weather variables coming from chirps and ERA5, temperature and precipitation. And so we took advantage of the geolocation or geolocalization of the survey data to integrate these sort of daily temperature and precipitation data for a very long period. And then, you can create all sorts of different variables, means, deviations, maximums, minimums, growing degree days, and so on, as a very large set of variables. And then the surveys are, they are disseminated with a number of other relevant geospatial variables, including some information on soil quality and elevation and agri-ecological zones. And so on these geospatial variables, we ran a sort of a lasso algorithm to select a subset just because of the sheer number of them. It was just a lot of them. So we used the lasso to select sort of a subset. Okay, so then with this setup, we test a number of specifications for kind of productivity, and these two are the main ones, and I'll show you the other ones in a second. So the first one is really just a yield time trend, right? So you have here a log value of production per unit of land on a linear time trend, and the CI is a country fixed effect, okay? So this is really just a linear yield trend, a raw yield trend. And the second model is something more akin to total factor productivity, because it controls for price-weighted inputs as well as on the output side. So these are all the wish I had a pointer here, but these are all the agricultural inputs here are all in this IL expression. And then there's all the control variables, and F of W is a function of weather variables. There's a control for crop that is grown and a country fixed effect, right? So this is sort of the full specification. Then we look at a few additional kind of policy relevant specifications, right? So in Model 3, we do the same as in Model 2, but we basically aggregate it up to the farm level. Then the next step is a model aggregated to the farm level, but there we use farm fixed effects, right? Like I said, we can track farms/households through time, so we can use a farm level fixed effects to net out time invariant farm characteristics. Similarly with farmers, right? So every farm has, one to several farmers, and we can observe them, each what they produce, and also through time. So we can do the same, but with a farmer level model. Then Model 6 goes one step further, and we aggregate it all up to the cluster level with cluster level fixed effects. And finally, the last model is the one I mentioned already, where basically we swap out those constant prices for time and spatially variant prices. So basically, for each point in time, in each small geographic area, each crop gets their own value, right? All right, then we implement this very simply with an OLS weighted by adjusted population weights. Population weights are adjusted because we have to account for the fact that households have several plots. So it's very simple, very simple setup. Let me show you the basic results that we find. So what you see here is the coefficient on the linear time trend, the annual change in productivity from the 7 specifications that I was showing you before. And it sort of speaks for itself, but we find across almost all of these specifications a significant negative time trend in the overall sample, right? Of all of the smallholder farms in our overall sample. This ranges sort of from let's say 2 to 5.5%, depending on the model. Model 7, I recall, is the one that uses the time-specific prices. Model 6, the one that isn't statistically significantly different from 0, is the cluster level model. Okay. Now, underlying this overall negative trend in the pool sample is a lot of country level heterogeneity. So I'm going to show you that now. So these are the 6 countries in the sample, and Model 1 was the simple time trend. Model 2 was the sort of fully specified TFP specification. And what we can see here is that there are 3 countries in which there is kind of a flat, no growth, but also no decline trend. That's Ethiopia, Mali, and Tanzania. Then there is Niger, where we find this massive jump between 2011 and 2014. And then there is a significant negative time trend in Malawi and in Nigeria. And this comes together to kind of form this overall negative time trend in the pool sample. Okay. Now, I want to also show you the impact that individual countries have on this pool time trend, right? Because this is sort of the headline finding, and I want to be really transparent about what is happening in the sample. And so, what I'm showing you here is a set of results where we drop one country from the pool sample, one country each, right? So here in column 2 is Ethiopia that's dropped, column 3 it's Malawi that's dropped, and so on. And as you can see, these all look very similar, except when you drop Nigeria, which is not that surprising because Nigeria had this very strong negative time trend. And so Nigeria is really driving the difference between finding no growth in productivity and finding a negative growth. Then these are the results by different crop groups in the pooled sample. As you can see here, they're also, by and large, relatively similar, and many of them are also negative. So it doesn't really seem like there are certain crop groups that are really driving this decline, or others that are doing really well. But rather, it sort of looks negative to null in most of them, right? Okay, I have some more time. I want to show you this result, which you can't see entirely, but it's basically sort of we were trying to look at some heterogeneity by different farmer characteristics, and this is the gender of the farmer, the gender of the plot manager. And so what you can see here in the first column is the baseline result that I've already showed you. In the second column is the columns 2, 3, and 4 are the result of an interaction. So we interacted the annual time trend with a dummy for female managers. And so column 2 shows you the time trend on plots managed by male farmers. Column 3 shows you the difference in productivity change between male and female farmers, and column 4 shows you the productivity change on plots run by female farmers. And so if you just look at the first row for the pool sample, the thing that this shows you is that the time trend on plots run by female farmers was significantly less negative. I guess that's the most positive way of putting it. And this sort of holds in a few countries also, right? Like there's several countries here where it doesn't make a difference, but I can count here 1, 2, 3 cases in which female farmers had a less negative trend than male farmers. And we can discuss this a little bit more later on if you would like. Okay, so let me get to the sort of summary and discussion. What we find in this, this is a short descriptive paper. So what we find is, headline is this negative overall time trend, which holds across a really wide range of specifications. But of course, there's a lot of underlying heterogeneity at the country level. And, having framed this in terms of the investments in agricultural research, there's obviously the question is sort of, what does this mean? Like, did these investments not pay off? It's obviously we don't have a counterfactual, so it's very hard to say anything about that. The point is, there hasn't been much growth in these data sets that we use for this analysis. Now, there are a couple of pretty important limitations, right? The first one is that this is a short panel. I think it's like 13, 14 years. So, we may just need more time for like really clean productivity growth trends to materialize. So maybe we come back to this analysis in 2025 or 28 and we'll find a neater, cleaner story that maybe, thank you, that maybe has different implications. Then I think the second one is that these are household farms, so they're from the smallholder sector. And so this is, of course, owed to the household survey sampling approach of these surveys. But, it's quite possible that there is, in these agricultural sectors in these countries, there is a sort of a commercial sector, a nascent commercial sector, or large farms that we don't see in this sample, and that maybe are super productive and maybe are growing in productivity. All of this is not something that we can observe with this sample. To the extent that there are numbers on what share of agricultural production and agricultural labor is between the smallholder sector and the commercial sector, it still seems like the overwhelming majority is in the smallholder sector. But in any case, it's a limitation of these data. Then, since this first draft that I submitted to this conference, we tried to sort of look at what might explain, at least in part, some of the absence of growth or what might be dragging down the productivity over time, right? And we explored a fairly wide range of hypotheses, and so far to essentially no avail. So we looked at land degradation, crop suitability, shocks and disasters, selection in the sample over time, change in the crop mix, diversification, and also sort of shift in input intensity, substitutions in different inputs. And, maybe someone who's much better at econometrics to figure out a way of teasing these effects out better. But basically, it was always, it never yielded anything. This time trend is very persistent, or has proven very persistent. I'm also keen to hear what people here think. It's well possible that there is certain shocks that we fail to capture in these data, right? Like, for instance, flood seems to be playing a big role, but they're not captured very consistently across the different surveys. So, probably something we fail to capture explains this. So far I cannot really tell you why. I can just tell you that this is what we are observing in these data sets. And with that, I'm going to close my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. It was a very insightful paper. I think I enjoyed reading the paper. I particularly like the idea of combining the different panel data sets, which is very insightful because it's something that I wanted to do. It was in my to-do list, but now we have done it. But I'll have to find out another way of improving that kind of research. Using panel data from 6 big countries in Africa, including the 2 biggest countries, Ethiopia and Nigeria, 30,000 farmers collected between 2008 and 2019, matched with detailed weather data, productivity analysis, so productivity did not really change despite over the $2 billion investment. That's the main message that I got that paper. A few suggestions if I were to write this paper, just to comment on the write-up when I read it, I would have motivated it as a general interest paper. Maybe you have another ambition for a different audience, because the fact that this is a productivity analysis using 30,000 households, that's really important and very novel for the general interest reader, in my view. So that's one. So the identification strategy, I see the different alternative models, but I would have tried like a dynamic model, which is very often used in productivity analysis, and especially in production function estimation, like system GMM, Alem bond kind, because these panel data models are based on strict exogeneity assumptions, especially the inputs, for example, are not strictly exogenous. So it would help actually if you try that kind of model. You control for climate variables. There's been some research, a couple of GIM papers controlling for additional climate variables like sunshine, heat, stress, for example, are important variables in explaining productivity and agricultural yield. Both of them are actually, for some reasons, are from China, but 2019, Wang and co-authors. Happy to share the papers with you. I would check for, in addition to temperature and precipitation, I think these additional climatic variables, at least heat stress, because some of the crops that you used are highly sensitive for heat stress as well. You put it right at the end, and I think you have done it after I read the paper, but of course it would be great to shed light on why did productivity did not change. One reason, as you anticipated or kind of explained, is you're using one period. I can give you Ethiopia as a good example. Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa for over 15 years, until 2018. So this period that you covered is the period where we already reached higher productivity. Higher productivity. So that might be one reason. So what I would do is, for some of the countries, I would go back and check, compare within country kind of comparisons with different eras. Because you have Ethiopian household data from the 1990s, you have Ugandan panel data from the 1990s. So I'll compare Uganda in the time period that you did in the previous time period. So a final comment would be, I would be a bit careful with the outcome variable because it is based on too much aggregations. You converted them into prices, using different prices, you converted them to values. How about picking up one crop? Maize, for example, is produced in most of the countries except in Ethiopia. Nigeria and Ghana, I work on 3 of those panel data sets. I know that Nigeria and Malawi, and also the Tanzanians, they produce a lot of maize. I would focus on maize on per kilo or per hectare as an outcome variable instead of the values, and see to what extent my results still hold. Otherwise, it's a great paper, great co-authors as well. I made some over a beer last time.
Good. Thanks so much. Okay, let's take, I'll respond to these, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to also take some.
So I'm wondering why you used out per hectare. Now, I think I know part of the answer to that question. At least World Bank is part of the corporate scorecard that is expected of all agricultural projects, blah, blah, blah. But actually, land is not scarce in Africa, mostly. And the issue is really labor productivity. So it would seem to me you could use this data set to also look at labor productivity. I know for Harvesting Prosperity, Keith Fugley looked at total productivity, and you could look at that as well. So maybe you've already done that in a different paper and I just didn't read it. That was my reaction.
Okay, I will take like maybe 3 and then 3 again. So, yeah.
So just briefly, I think that your concern about you're missing, say, the large farm sector, I'm not sure. I think that's unlikely to change your results, but it seems like you could wait by the size of the farms, and that you'll still be missing, like maybe Nigeria and I don't know, Tanzania are 2 places where there is a large farm sector you're missing. But weighted by farm size could tell us whether that's biasing your data.
Okay. Yeah.
It's just a small suggestion related to the previous comment. I was wondering if you looked into Solo's taxonal change methodology to measure total factor productivity. It's slightly less limiting than using input weights of change in production.
Okay. Let me just quickly respond to these, and then it's 10:25, so I'll do more if there's more. So yeah, Yonas, thank you so much for the comments. We actually set this up as a general interest paper, and then I wrote this sort of slightly more working paper version that you wrote. So good spot. Yeah, thanks so much for your comments on other climate variables, aggregation, GMM. We'll take this on board and check it out. So thanks so much. Okay, output per hectare versus labor productivity, land versus labor productivity. There's these 2 specifications. So for the second one, because this is sort of basically total productivity, because we control for all the inputs, whether we use land or labor makes no difference, almost, in the results. We actually tried this in the paper, and it makes almost no difference for the overall findings. Okay? So yeah, but we.
So that's the sensitivity analysis you referred to that you didn't discuss.
Yeah.
All right. I'll come.
Okay, weight by farm size. Thank you. That's a really good suggestion. As the so low.
I can send you the.
Okay, thank you. All right, maybe we have 4 more minutes. If yes.
I was wondering if it's possible to look at heterogeneity within countries, whether there might be some regions that actually have higher growth and some regions that actually face conflicts or severe shocks that not experience growth there.
Okay, Travis.
Yeah, question on the aggregation at the plot level. And I realize intercropping and border, those tend to be non-trivial, but also kind of a small share. But I do wonder, I mean, maybe you can comment on this, if that might, I think women manage plots maybe a little bit more likely to be intercropped. Just curious if there's some measurement thing about how the crops are aggregated to plot level, and maybe there's something systematic there about women managing plots.
Okay. All right. Let me respond to these. So, country level heterogeneity. So you mean like one region did well, another region did poorly. So we did a little bit of this in Nigeria, and I think at the end of the day, you'll find certain areas that are doing well, but you need to go pretty small to find them. So this is, like I was saying, even within country, quite a persistent sort of results. Yeah, depending on, some countries it goes up, some countries it's flat, some countries go down. On the aggregation point, yeah, I mean, I can imagine that there's something systematic about sort of plot size. So we see that it tends to be the case that like larger plots in particular have sort of dropped in productivity. Yeah, and so I guess it could play a role. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to preclude that measurement is playing a big role here in general. Yeah, working on these surveys, you can never really exclude it.
It seems to me we did run some specifications where we dropped intercropped.
All right, we did do that.
And I think there was a lot of results were quite robust to that. There are these interesting plot size effects, and so there's tons of stuff going on. And I think everything we try to hit it with is, so there's lots of stuff going on within the big picture. The main country level results and the aggregate results.
Yeah.
It's quite a way to get it.
This is true, yeah, we split it like this.
We did drop intercropped plots. That's always an issue with the aggregation and weighting. The price weighting itself doesn't matter very much. It's just the arbitrary set of weights. We tried looking at the panel of parcels, right? We can actually track the same parcels over time, which is a very limited set. We get the same results on the same pieces of land, which doesn't think about degradation. Anyway, we still don't have a why.
Maybe next year. All right, I think this is our time. Thanks so much, everyone.